If you've ever kept someone else's secret because speaking up could cost you everything, your job, your safety, your only way to feed your children, then this story is going to hit you harder than you expect. For 7 years, Patience Okonkwo cleaned every room in the Ashford mansion. She knew which floorboards creaked. She knew which doors didn't lock. She knew which walls were thin enough to hear through. And on a Tuesday evening in September, standing in the hallway outside the study with a dust rag in one hand and her whole life in the other, she heard something through those thin walls that turned her blood to ice. 2 voices, a plan, a name, and a deadline. 72 hours. That's how long the family she loved had before everything they owned, their home, their business, their children's future, would be taken from them. Patience had 72 hours to decide. Stay silent and stay safe, or speak up and lose everything. So glad you're here. Before the story starts, please like and subscribe. And one more thing, drop your location in the comments. Are you watching from Chicago, Accra, maybe Montego Bay or Dublin? Let us know. Now, let me tell you about this house. Because the house matters. The house is where everything happened, and where everything almost ended. The Ashford house sat at the top of Briarcliff Road, on a piece of land that sloped upward from the street, like the earth itself was trying to lift the house closer to the sky. It was old, built in 1928 by a man named Arthur Ashford, who made his money in textiles and spent it on stone. The house was 3 stories of gray stone with white trim, a slate roof that turned silver in the rain, and a front porch with 4 columns that were purely decorative, but made the house look like it had opinions about itself. There were 14 rooms. A kitchen with a 6-burner stove and copper pots hanging from a rack that was original to the house. A library on the 2nd floor with built-in shelves and a rolling ladder, and a window seat where the afternoon light fell in a golden square that moved across the cushion as the hours passed. A dining room with a mahogany table that sat 12, and a chandelier with so many crystals that cleaning it took Patience an entire morning and left her neck sore for 2 days. The house smelled different depending on the season. In winter, it smelled like wood smoke from the 2 fireplaces, and the pine garlands Mrs. Ashford hung on the banisters every December. In spring, it smelled like the lilac bushes outside the kitchen windows. 4 bushes planted by Arthur Ashford's wife Helen 90 years ago, and still blooming, still fragrant, still stubbornly alive. In summer, it smelled like cut grass and the lemon polish Patience used on the banisters. In fall, it smelled like nothing, like stone, like the house was holding its breath. September was when the house held its breath. Now, the family. Martin Ashford was 56 years old. He was the 3rd generation to live in the house and the 2nd generation to run the family business, Ashford and Associates, an architectural firm that had been designing buildings in the region for 60 years. Martin was not a large man, 5'10", average build, but he had a presence that made rooms feel organized when he walked in. He had salt and pepper hair he kept short, brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a habit of standing with his hands clasped behind his back, like a man examining something he was about to either approve or redesign. He wore button-down shirts rolled to the elbows, even in meetings, because he said a man who keeps his sleeves down is a man who plans to keep his hands clean. And Martin didn't trust clean hands. He was kind. That is important. Not performatively kind, not the kind that makes speeches about community and writes checks with his name on them. Structurally kind, the kind of kindness that is built into the way a person moves through the world. He held doors without thinking about it. He remembered the names of his employees' children. He paid his contractors fairly and on time, which in the architecture business was rare enough to be remarkable. He called Patience by her name, always her full name, Patience, never shortened, never the maid, never the help. And when he passed her in the hallway, he would stop and ask, "How are the boys?" and wait for the answer. His wife was Diane Ashford, née Tremaine, 53 years old, a woman who had been beautiful in her 20s and was more beautiful in her 50s because the years had given her face a depth that youth didn't have. The kind of beauty that comes from laughing hard and crying hard and standing in a kitchen at midnight worrying about a child and still getting up in the morning and putting on earrings. She had auburn hair going silver at the temples, green eyes, and a voice that was warm even when she was furious, which made her fury more effective, because you could hear the love underneath it, like a fire burning under a blanket of snow. Diane ran the household, managed the family's charitable foundation, and volunteered 3 days a week at a literacy center downtown where she taught adults to read. She had been teaching there for 11 years. She knew the names of every student she'd ever had. They had 3 children. The oldest was Michael, 26, living in the city working as a junior architect at a rival firm, which Martin said was fine, in a voice that meant it was not entirely fine, but he respected the independence. The middle child was Sophie, 22, finishing her last year of college, studying environmental science, calling home every Sunday evening at exactly 7 o'clock, because Sophie was the kind of person who kept schedules the way some people kept promises. And the youngest was Oliver. Oliver was 15. He was the one who lived in the house full-time, the one who came downstairs every morning with bedhead and a vocabulary word he'd learned the night before that he would use incorrectly at breakfast until Diane gently corrected him and he would say, "I knew that, Mom." Oliver played the cello. Badly, but with feeling. You could hear him practicing on the 3rd floor in the evenings, long, scraping notes that sounded like a cat being slowly compressed. But occasionally, maybe once an evening, a passage would emerge that was genuinely beautiful, and Patience would stop whatever she was doing and listen and think, "There, that's the one." And then there was the brother. Martin had a younger brother named Gerald. Gerald Ashford was 52. He did not live in the house. He lived in a modern apartment in the city, the kind with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that looked like it had been designed by someone who had never sat in a chair. Gerald was the opposite of Martin in every way that mattered. Where Martin was structural, Gerald was theatrical. Where Martin clasped his hands behind his back, Gerald waved his in the air. Where Martin wore rolled sleeves and wire-rimmed glasses, Gerald wore Italian suits and a watch that cost more than Patience made in a year. He had a full head of dark hair he was too proud of, a jaw that was sharper than Martin's, and a smile that appeared frequently and meant nothing. Gerald was supposed to be Martin's partner in the firm. That was how their father, Richard, had designed it. 2 sons, 2 roles, 1 business. Martin would handle design and clients. Gerald would handle finance and operations. For 10 years, it worked. Then it didn't. Gerald had a habit, a talent, really, for spending money he didn't have and promising things he couldn't deliver. He invested in projects that collapsed. He extended credit to clients who never paid. He borrowed against the firm's future without telling Martin. And 3 years ago, Martin discovered that Gerald had taken out a second mortgage on the Ashford house. The family house, the house with the columns and the chandelier and the lilac bushes, without Martin's knowledge, using forged authorization. Martin confronted Gerald. The conversation happened in the library, behind closed doors. Patience was cleaning the hallway outside. She heard raised voices. She heard Martin say, "You forged my signature." She heard Gerald say, "I was trying to save the business." She heard Martin say, "You were trying to save yourself." And she heard the sound of something. Not breaking, not slamming, just the sound of 2 brothers reaching the end of a road they had been walking together their whole lives and finding a wall. Gerald was removed from the firm. Not fired. Martin couldn't do that to their father's memory. He was given a buyout, a generous one, enough to live on. Gerald took it. He didn't speak to Martin for 18 months. Then he started coming around again. Sunday dinners, holidays. He called Diane on her birthday. He brought Oliver a book about famous cellists. He smiled his nothing smile, and he waited. But what happened next changed everything. Now let me tell you about Patience. Patience Okonkwo was 41 years old. She was a sturdy woman, not tall, not short, just solid, the way a well-built house is solid. She had dark brown skin, round cheeks, and eyes that missed nothing. Her hair was always covered when she worked. A head wrap, usually navy blue or dark green, knotted neatly at the back. She wore flat shoes that made no sound on the stone floors, which wasn't a choice but a necessity. Patience had learned long ago that the best way to do her job well was to move through the house like air. Present but unnoticed. Useful but invisible. She'd been cleaning the Ashford house for 7 years. Before that, she'd cleaned 3 other houses, a doctor's family, a lawyer's family, a retired judge who lived alone and whose house smelled like pipe tobacco and regret. She was good at cleaning the way some people are good at music, not because she loved it, though she took pride in it, but because she understood it. She understood that a clean house wasn't just about surfaces. It was about rhythm, about knowing which rooms need attention on which days, about understanding that the kitchen needs different care than the library, and the library needs different care than the children's rooms, and all of it needs to be done in an order that respects the family's life without interrupting it. She came from Nigeria, from Aba. She had arrived in this country 12 years ago with her husband Chukwuma, who everyone called Chu, and their first son, Emmanuel, who was 3 at the time. Chu worked in a warehouse. Long hours, night shifts. The kind of work that takes the softness out of a man's hands and puts it somewhere deep inside where only his family can find it. They had a second son, David, born 2 years after they arrived. Emmanuel was 15 now. David was 10. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the south side of the city. 3rd floor, no elevator, a kitchen window that looked out onto a parking lot. The apartment was small, but clean. Patience kept it the way she kept the Ashford house. With rhythm, with care, with the quiet understanding that a space is only as good as the love you put into maintaining it. Patience loved the Ashford family. That is the complication. She didn't just work for them. She loved them. She loved Martin's structural kindness and Diane's warm fury and Oliver's terrible cello and the way Sophie called every Sunday at 7. She loved the house, the creaking floorboards, the lilac bushes, the chandelier that took an entire morning. She had spent 7 years inside these walls, and the walls had become hers in the way that anything you care for deeply becomes yours, even if your name is never on the deed. And that love, that specific, complicated, one-directional love of a woman who cleans a family's home and knows their secrets and is paid $11.50 an hour, was about to be tested in a way that would break her apart and put her back together as someone different. And that was only the beginning. It was a Tuesday evening in September, 6:45. The house was holding its breath. Martin and Diane had gone to a charity event downtown. Oliver was at a friend's house for the night. The house was empty except for Patience, who was finishing her shift. She worked 10 to 7, 5 days a week, and she always used the last hour to do the deep cleaning tasks she couldn't do when the family was home. Polishing the silver, cleaning the high shelves in the library, dusting the study. The study was Martin's room. A small room off the library with a desk, a drafting table, 2 chairs, and a wall of framed architectural drawings. Buildings Martin had designed, sketched in pencil and ink, precise and beautiful. The room smelled like graphite and old wood. Patience cleaned it every Tuesday. She dusted the desk, wiped the drafting table, emptied the trash, and polished the window that looked out onto the garden where the lilac bushes grew. She was in the hallway, heading toward the study with her rag and her spray bottle, when she heard voices inside. She stopped. The house was supposed to be empty. Martin and Diane were gone. Oliver was gone. Who was in the study? She stood still. The hallway was dim. She hadn't turned on the overhead light because she knew the house well enough to clean it by the light that came through the windows. She listened. 2 voices, both male. One she recognized immediately. Gerald. The sharp, theatrical voice, the one that filled whatever space it was in the way Martin's organized it. The other voice she didn't recognize. Deeper, slower. The kind of voice that chose its words the way a man chooses tools, precisely, for function, not for show. Gerald said, "The filing deadline is Thursday. Once the petition goes through, the court will freeze the assets pending review. The house, the firm, everything." The other voice said, "And your brother?" Gerald said, Martin doesn't know. He doesn't know about the debt restructuring or the lien. He thinks the buyout settled everything. But I retained a 15% silent interest in the firm through the original partnership agreement, the one Father signed in 1994. Martin never had it voided. His lawyer missed it. My lawyer didn't. Patience's hand tightened on the spray bottle. She pressed her back against the wall. The other voice, a lawyer, Patience guessed, or someone who talked like one, said, "If the petition is filed Thursday, the preliminary hearing would be within 2 weeks. If the court finds the interest valid, your brother's controlling share is diluted. The firm's decision-making structure changes. You'd have grounds to force a sale or a dissolution." Gerald said, "I don't want to dissolve it. I want control. The firm should have been mine from the beginning. Father gave Martin the design side and gave me the books. And then when I made one mistake," the other voice said, "You forged his signature on a mortgage, Gerald." Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That was a miscalculation. This is different. This is legal. This is using the instruments Father set up. The partnership agreement gives me standing. Once the assets are frozen, Martin can't operate. He can't pay his contractors. He can't close his current projects. He'll have to negotiate, and when he does, I'll be in the stronger position." The other voice said, "And the house?" Gerald said, "The house is collateral on the existing mortgage. The second mortgage I took out 3 years ago. If Martin's assets are frozen, he can't service that debt. The bank forecloses. I buy it at auction through a holding company." The other voice said, "You'd take your brother's house." Gerald said, "It's not his house. It's the family house, and the family includes me." Patience stood in the dark hallway and felt the floor move beneath her feet. Not physically, structurally, the way a building shifts when the foundation cracks. She was holding a spray bottle and a dust rag, and she had just heard a plan, a precise, legal, calculated plan to take everything from the family she had loved for 7 years. 72 hours. Thursday. That was the deadline. Now here is where Patience had to choose. She finished cleaning. She did it mechanically, hands moving, mind elsewhere. She polished the window in the guest bathroom. She wiped the kitchen counters. She emptied the trash in the mudroom. She did everything she was supposed to do because the body knows its rhythm even when the mind is breaking apart. At 7 o'clock, she locked the side door, the one the staff used, the one that opened onto the driveway, and she walked to the bus stop on Briarcliff Road. She stood under the streetlight with her bag on her shoulder and her flat shoes on the pavement, and she waited for the number 12 bus, and she thought. She could say nothing. She could go home, make dinner for Chu and the boys, help David with his homework, check Emmanuel's school uniform for the morning, and pretend she hadn't heard anything. Nobody would know. Gerald wouldn't know she was in the hallway. Martin wouldn't know what was coming until it was too late. Patience would keep her job. She would keep her $11.50 an hour. She would keep the rhythm. She would keep the silence. Or she could speak. She could tell Martin what she heard. But telling Martin meant admitting she had listened. And listening, even accidentally, to a private conversation in a home you are paid to clean is dangerous territory. What if Martin didn't believe her? What if Gerald found out she had spoken and came after her? Not physically, but legally, the way powerful men come after powerless women, with lawyers and accusations and the quiet machinery of people who know how to make other people disappear. What if she lost her job? What if the family's response was to fire the woman who brought them trouble, the way kings in old stories killed the messengers who brought bad news? She got on the bus. She rode 35 minutes to her apartment. She climbed 3 flights of stairs. She opened the door. Chu was in the kitchen, making rice. Emmanuel was on the couch, reading a textbook. David was on the floor, building something with wooden blocks. A tower, leaning dangerously to the left, held up by the stubbornness of a 10-year-old who refused to let it fall. Chu looked at her. He said, "You're quiet." Patience said, "Long day." Chu studied her face. He had known her for 20 years. He could read her silences the way she could read a house, by rhythm, by weight, by what was missing. He said, "Sit down, eat. We'll talk after the boys sleep." They ate. rice, and stew. Emmanuel talked about his biology class, a frog dissection he had been dreading for a week. David talked about his tower, which he said was going to be the tallest building ever built out of blocks. Patience listened. She smiled. She nodded. She chewed food she couldn't taste. After the boys were in bed, Emmanuel in the top bunk with his textbook, David in the bottom bunk with a block still in his hand because he fell asleep building, Patience sat at the kitchen table with Chu. She told him everything. Chu listened the way Chu listened to everything. Silently, completely, with his calloused hands folded on the table. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. From the bedroom, David murmured something in his sleep. Chu said, "What do you want to do?" Patience said, "I don't know." Chu said, "Yes, you do." Patience looked at her hands, her working hands, the hands that had polished the Ashford chandelier and wiped the Ashford counters and dusted the Ashford study every Tuesday for 7 years. She said, "I want to tell them. I want to warn them. But if I do," Chu said, "if you do, you might lose the job." She said, "We can't afford to lose the job, Chu." He said, "We can't afford to lose you either." She looked at him. His face was calm, but his eyes were fierce. The softness he kept deep inside where only his family could find it. It was right there, on the surface, for her. He said, "Patience, you clean that family's house. You know their children. You love them. I've heard you talk about that boy and his cello. I've heard you talk about the mother who teaches people to read. If someone was planning to destroy our family, and a person who knew stayed silent because they were afraid of losing a job, what would you think of that person?" Patience didn't answer. She didn't need to. Chu said, "Go tomorrow. Go early. Tell them." Patience said, "And if they fire me?" Chu reached across the table and took her hand. His rough hand on her rough hand. He said, "Then we figure it out. The way we've always figured it out. Together." But what Patience didn't know yet was that the next 48 hours would test every bond she had, with the family, with herself, and with a man who was far more dangerous than she imagined. Wednesday morning. Patience arrived at the Ashford house at 9 o'clock, an hour early. She used her key to let herself in through the side door. The house smelled like coffee. Martin was in the kitchen, standing at the counter, reading something on his tablet, his sleeves already rolled to the elbows at 9 in the morning. Diane was upstairs. Oliver was at school. Patience set down her bag. She stood in the kitchen doorway. Martin looked up. He saw her face and his expression changed. Not dramatically, just a slight shift, the way a building settles when weight is applied to a specific point. He said, "Patience, you're early." She said, "Mr. Ashford, I need to speak with you." He set down the tablet. He looked at her. He said, "Of course." She told him, all of it. Standing in his kitchen, with the copper pots hanging above and the smell of coffee in the air and the lilac bushes visible through the window, she told him what she heard. Gerald's voice, the other voice, the partnership agreement, the 15%, the filing deadline, Thursday, the plan to freeze the assets, the plan to take the house. Martin didn't interrupt. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, the examining stance, the approving or redesigning stance, and he listened. His face went through changes, surprise, confusion, pain, and then something harder, something that looked like a foundation being reinforced. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. He unclasped his hands. He clasped them again. He said, "You heard this last night?" She said, "Yes, sir. In the hallway outside the study. I was cleaning." He said, "You could have said nothing." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Why didn't you?" Patience looked at the floor. Then she looked at him. She said, "Because this is not just your house, Mr. Ashford. I have cleaned every room for 7 years. I have polished every banister and washed every window and listened to your son play that cello from the 3rd floor. I know which floorboards creak and which doors stick in the rain and which shelf in the library has the book Mrs. Ashford reads every Christmas. This house is yours, but I have carried it in my hands for 7 years, and I cannot carry it and stay silent at the same time." Martin looked at this woman, this 5'4" woman in a head wrap and flat shoes who made $11.50 an hour and who had just risked her livelihood to warn him about his own brother. He took off his glasses. He cleaned them on his sleeve. He put them back on. He said, "Thank you, Patience." She said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "I'm going to call my lawyer." Stay with us, because the next 24 hours moved like a storm. Martin called his lawyer, a woman named Claire Dufresne, 51, sharp as broken glass, the kind of lawyer who wore reading glasses on a chain and wielded them like a weapon. She arrived at the house by 11. She and Martin spent 2 hours in the study, the same study where Gerald had laid out his plan the night before. Claire reviewed the original partnership agreement. She found it. The clause. The 15% silent interest. Gerald was right. It had never been voided. Martin's previous lawyer had missed it. A single paragraph in a 30-year-old document signed by their father in 1994 that gave Gerald legal standing to challenge the firm's structure. Claire said, "He has a case. Not a strong one. The forged mortgage complicates his standing. But if he files Thursday and the court freezes your assets, you'll be operating in quicksand for months. Maybe a year." Martin said, "Can we stop the filing?" Claire said, "We can file a preemptive motion to void the partnership interest based on Gerald's prior fraud, the forged signature. If we file first, we establish the narrative. We frame it as a bad faith attempt by a partner who was removed for cause." Martin said, "When do you need to file?" Claire said, "Yesterday, but tomorrow morning will do." She left at 1 o'clock. Martin sat in the study. Diane came in. She had been told. Her face was the face of a woman whose warm fury was operating at full capacity, controlled, precise, burning under snow. She sat across from Martin and said, "Gerald was in our house last night, using our study to plan our destruction, while we were at a charity dinner." Martin said, "Yes." Diane said, "And Patience heard it." Martin said, "Yes." Diane said, "We need to give that woman a raise." Martin almost smiled. Almost. Now, pay attention to what comes next. Because Gerald didn't know that Patience had heard, and he was about to find out. Wednesday evening. Gerald came to the house for dinner. A planned visit. He had called Diane earlier in the week and asked if he could come by. Charm maintenance, the nothing smile. He arrived at 6:30 with a bottle of wine that cost $80 and a gift for Oliver, a book about Yo-Yo Ma. Patience was still in the house. She had stayed late. Martin had asked her to, not in so many words, but with a look that said, "I need you here." She was in the kitchen, cleaning the counters, moving silently in her flat shoes, invisible the way she had always been. Gerald walked into the kitchen to find a glass for the wine. He saw Patience. He nodded at her the way he always did, the acknowledging without seeing nod, the furniture nod. He opened the cabinet. He said, "Red wine glasses, where are they?" Patience said, "Second shelf behind the white ones." Gerald reached up. He paused. He turned and looked at her. Really looked at her, for perhaps the first time in the years he had been coming to this house. Something in his face shifted. A flicker. He said, "Were you here last night?" Patience's hand tightened on the sponge she was holding. She said, "I leave at 7 every day, Mr. Ashford." Gerald studied her face. He said, 6:45. "Were you still here at 6:45? Patience met his eyes. She said, "I was cleaning, sir." Gerald held the wine glass. He didn't pour. He stood there with the glass in one hand and the bottle in the other, and his nothing smile doing something new. Thinning, tightening, becoming the smile of a man doing arithmetic in his head and not liking the answer. He said, "The study hallway. You clean the study on Tuesdays." Patience didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was the answer. Gerald set the glass down. He set the bottle down. He leaned across the counter toward her and said, in a voice that was low and careful and carried the particular menace of a man who is used to making problems go away, "Whatever you think you heard wrong. And if you speak about it, to anyone, You will find yourself without a job, without a reference, and with a legal situation that will make your life very complicated. Do you understand me? Patience looked at this man with the Italian suit and the expensive watch and the nothing smile that had become something ugly. She looked at him, and she felt something rise inside her that was older than fear. It was the thing that made her cross an ocean with a 3-year-old in a suitcase. It was the thing that made her climb 3 flights of stairs every night to a small apartment and cook dinner and check homework and build a life from nothing but her hands and her hours. It was the thing Chu saw in her when he said, "We'll figure it out." She said, "I understand you perfectly, Mr. Ashford." She picked up her bag. She walked to the side door. She opened it. Before she stepped out, she turned and said, "Your brother's wine glasses are on the second shelf, behind the white ones. I've been putting them there for 7 years, but I suppose you never noticed." She walked out. Gerald stood in the kitchen with the wine bottle sweating in his hand and a feeling in his stomach that he couldn't name, because men like Gerald don't have names for the feeling of being seen by someone they never bothered to look at. And just when you thought Gerald held all the power, the ground shifted beneath him. Thursday morning, 8 o'clock. Claire Dufresne filed the preemptive motion. She filed it 47 minutes before Gerald's lawyer filed the petition. 47 minutes. The difference between a building standing and a building falling. The court received both filings.
The judge, a woman named Judge Harriet Caldwell, 63, no nonsense, the kind of judge who read every document personally and didn't tolerate theatrics, scheduled the hearing for the following Monday. Gerald found out about Martin's filing at 9:30. His lawyer called him. Gerald called Martin. Martin didn't answer. Gerald called again. Martin answered on the 4th ring. Gerald said, "You filed against me." Martin said, "You were going to file against me. I went first." Gerald said, "How did you know?" Martin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It doesn't matter how. What matters is that you sat in our father's study and planned to take our father's house and our father's business from the family he built it for. And you did it while I was at a dinner raising money for children who can't read." Gerald said, "You don't understand the legal—" Martin said, "I understand everything, Gerald. I understand the 15%. I understand the lien.
I understand the holding company. I understand that you smiled at my wife and brought my son a book about Yo-Yo Ma while you were planning to take the roof from over his head." Gerald said, "Martin." Martin said, "Don't come to the house. Don't call Diane. Don't contact Oliver. And Gerald, the maid you threatened last night? Her name is Patience. She has worked in this house for 7 years. She knows every room better than you know any room you've ever been in. She heard you because she was doing her job. And she told me because she has more loyalty in her cleaning rag than you have in your entire body." He hung up. Gerald did not come to the house. The hearing was Monday. Claire presented Martin's case. Gerald's lawyer presented Gerald's. Judge Caldwell listened to both sides for 3 hours. She read the partnership agreement. She read the documentation of Gerald's forgery. She read the timeline of Gerald's removal from the firm. She ruled in Martin's favor. She voided the 15% interest on the grounds that Gerald's prior fraud, the forged signature on the mortgage, constituted a breach of fiduciary duty that invalidated his standing under the partnership agreement. She dismissed Gerald's petition. She ordered Gerald to bear the costs of both filings. Gerald sat in the courtroom with his Italian suit and his expensive watch and his nothing smile, and he looked like a building with no foundation, still shaped like something, but with nothing underneath holding it up. But this story isn't really about Gerald, and it isn't really about the courtroom. It's about what happened after. Martin came home from the hearing. He walked through the side door, the door Patience used, not the front door, and he found Patience in the kitchen cleaning the stove. It was Tuesday, her regular day for the stove. He said, "Patience." She turned around. Her hands were wet. She had a sponge in one hand and a bottle of stove cleaner in the other. She said, "Yes, sir?" He said, "We won." She nodded. She said, "Good." He said, "I need to talk to you about something." Patience set down the sponge. She set down the bottle. She stood with her hands at her sides, the way she always stood when Martin talked to her. Straight, attentive, present, waiting. Martin said, "Diane and I have discussed it. We want to offer you a different position." Patience's face didn't change. She said, "Different how?" Martin said, "We want you to manage the house. Not clean it. Manage it. Oversee the maintenance, the schedules, the vendors, the grounds. A full-time position with a salary, benefits, and health insurance for your family." Patience's hands, her working hands, her tired hands, the hands that had polished the chandelier and carried this house for 7 years, began to tremble. She pressed them flat against her apron. She said, "Mr. Ashford, He held up his hand. He said, "You risked your job to protect this family. You stood in this kitchen and told me the truth when the truth could have cost you everything. And then Gerald threatened you, and you didn't back down. Diane says I should give you a raise. I'm giving you something better. I'm giving you a seat at the table." Diane appeared in the doorway. She had been listening from the hall. She walked in and stood beside Martin and said, "Patience, this house has been standing for 96 years. It survived a depression, 2 recessions, and Gerald Ashford. It survived because people took care of it. You take care of it better than anyone ever has. We want you to keep doing that. Not on your knees with a sponge, but on your feet with authority." Patience looked at these two people, this man with the rolled sleeves and the wire-rimmed glasses, this woman with the warm fury and the silver temples, and she felt something she had not felt in 7 years of working in this house. She felt equal, not as a gesture, not as a performance, as a fact. The fact of 2 people looking at her and seeing not a maid, not a cleaner, not a woman with a rag and a spray bottle, but a person whose knowledge and loyalty and 7 years of quiet, rhythmic care had saved their family. She said, "I would like that very much." Diane stepped forward and hugged her. A real hug. The kind that happens between 2 women who have shared a house for 7 years and are finally sharing a moment. Patience hugged her back. She smelled Diane's perfume, the same perfume she had smelled on Diane's coats when she hung them in the closet, the same scent that was part of the house's rhythm. And she cried, quietly, into Diane's shoulder. 2 tears. 3. Then she straightened up and wiped her face with the corner of her apron and said, "I should finish the stove." Diane laughed. Martin laughed. Patience almost laughed, and then did laugh, and the kitchen with the copper pots and the 6-burner stove and the window that looked out onto 4 lilac bushes planted 90 years ago by a woman named Helen who believed that beautiful things should last. The kitchen filled up with the sound of 3 people laughing, which is the sound a house makes when it stops holding its breath. That evening, Patience went home. She climbed the 3 flights. She opened the door. Chu was in the kitchen making rice. Emmanuel was on the couch with his textbook. David was on the floor building a new tower, taller this time, still leaning left. Patience sat down at the kitchen table. Chu set a plate in front of her. He sat across from her and said, "Well?" She told him. The court, the ruling, the offer, the salary, the benefits, the health insurance. Health insurance for all of them for the first time since they arrived in this country. Chu listened. His face didn't change. Not because he wasn't moved, but because Chu's face saved its changes for the moments that mattered most. And this moment mattered so much that his face needed a moment to catch up. Then he smiled. A slow, wide, full smile. The smile he had given her 20 years ago when she said she would marry him. The smile she saw maybe twice a year and kept in her memory the way she kept everything. Carefully, in its place, in the rhythm of a life built by 2 hands that never stopped working. He said, "You see, we figured it out." She said, "We always do." David looked up from his tower. He said, "Mama, look. It's not falling anymore." He had added a support beam, a single block, placed at the base on the left side, propping up the lean. Simple. Structural. The kind of fix a 10-year-old discovers by instinct and an engineer discovers by training. Patience looked at that tower. A tower held up by 1 small block at the base. She said, "That's perfect, David." He said, I know. It just needed something to lean on. Patience reached across the table and took Chu's hand. She looked at her son's tower and her husband's smile and the small kitchen with the window that looked onto a parking lot, and she thought about the house on Briarcliff Road. The stone house with the columns and the chandelier and the lilac bushes, and the boy who played the cello badly but with feeling. 2 houses, one with 14 rooms and one with 4. One with a chandelier and one with a ceiling light that flickered when the upstairs neighbor walked too hard. But both of them held up by the same thing: people who cared enough to stay. People who carried the walls in their hands. People who leaned on each other when the structure tilted and held on until it straightened. Patience squeezed Chu's hand. He squeezed back. Oliver's cello drifted through her mind, the long, scraping notes, and then, just once, the passage that was beautiful. She closed her eyes. There. That's the one. And that's the end of today's story. But the lessons last forever. Like this video, subscribe if you haven't, and tell us in the comments which character reminded you of someone in your own life. See you soon.